As training progresses toward the track season, the intensity of sprint training needs to increase so that we're prepared for the demands of competition and that our training is progressing in a way that allows us to run fastest at the right time. So today we're going to talk about 6 different ways that you can intensify your sprint training so you can run fast and compete well this coming season. The first way you can intensify your sprint training is through changes in the distances you're sprinting. If effort is equal, shorter sprints will be slower than faster sprints. 40 to 80 meter sprints will have a higher average velocity than something like a 10 or a 30 meter sprint. For example, if you ran a 20 meter sprint and it took you 3 seconds to do it, your average velocity would be 6.6 meters per second. Now, if you ran a 60 and your performance was pretty much equivalent, say you ran 7 seconds for that 60, then you'd have an average velocity of 8.5 meters per second. So the average velocity of the sprint would be higher, the peak velocity you reached would be higher, and a greater proportion of the amount of time you spent sprinting would be at a higher velocity compared to as if you were doing much shorter sprints. Short to long progressions help bake in intensification into the program, increasing intensity as your body adapts and sprinting distances increase. If you want to intensify sprint training, sprint over distances which allow you to reach high velocities. And by doing a short to long program, you can introduce shorter sprints which have a lower average velocity, and then as you adapt to those, you can increase the distance where now your average velocity of all the sprints you're doing are increasing, and this increase in average velocity will help you to run faster over time because you're exposing your body to faster sprints for a greater proportion of your workload. The second thing we can do to intensify our sprint training is to change the rest periods we're using. If rest periods are too short, recovery is inadequate to replenish ATP, creatine phosphate, and glycolytic energy systems. If performing maximal effort sprints, excessively short rest periods will reduce the speed you can attain and reduce the overall intensity of the workout. The workout may be very hard with short rest periods. Your heart rate might be pumping, your lungs will be going, you'll feel pretty tired, like you really worked hard, but the actual speed at which you're running may not be as high as it could be. Conversely, excessively long rest periods will impair your ability to stay warm, and if you sit around too much between sprints, you may feel sluggish and tired. For most athletes, 1 to 2 minutes of rest per 10 meters sprinted, especially if you're doing shorter sprints, will help keep your rest periods in a good place and allow for a nice balance of good recovery while also being able to stay warm. And if you emphasize proper rest periods during your workouts, you'll have a better effect from the workout, you'll have a higher intensity throughout the workout, and ultimately it will lead to intensifying your training over time. The third thing we can do is add an element of competition in practice. So sprinting by yourself has some advantages during the early phases of the year, such as allowing you to focus on what you're doing without being distracted by other sprinters. You can work on technique, you can work on really honing your race pattern, and just getting used to sprinting without any added stress of competition or anybody else to distract you. But once the ability to sprint well by yourself is stabilized and you've done that enough, then we need to progress further toward the stresses of competition to ensure we're prepared for the task at hand. Sprinting against other athletes in practice will help you stabilize sprinting skills in a higher stress environment, in an environment that is similar to competition. Racing other people increases the intensity of your training by encouraging you to run as fast as you can, and will also help you get used to the feeling of being in competition. Whether you're chasing someone, being chased, or sprinting from the line at the same time as someone else, having that person to race against is going to make you run your fastest because nobody wants to get beat. And having that sense of having to outrun someone else taps into some deep systems within our body, some evolutionary mechanisms within us that can help ensure we run as fast as possible in practice. Make sure to also add in some method of reaction time as well, so that way you can train the specific skill of initiating your sprint in response to an audible cue, such as a clap, a starting gun, or one of the runners saying set, go. The fourth thing we can do to intensify our sprint training is to emphasize non-resisted sprints. Resisted sprints are useful for developing qualities related to acceleration, and I use them in my training and the training of my athletes. But it's important to use them at the appropriate times. Because the speeds are slower with resisted sprints, projection angles are different, and ground contact times are longer, athletes should transition away from resisted sprints as they approach the season. Early in the off season, you might be doing more resisted than non-resisted sprints, such as 2 sled pulls followed by a non-resisted sprint. Then you might transition to a 50-50 split where for every 1 resisted sprint, you do 1 non-resisted sprint. Then you transition toward maybe 1 resisted sprint to 2 non-resisted sprints. And then eventually you're doing workouts where the only thing you're doing is sprinting without resistance. This progression will inherently allow for intensification of your sprint training, as the average speed of all your sprints will increase as resisted sprint volumes decrease. pace. If you want, you can maintain some light resisted sprints in your warm-up, but if you do this, I would suggest keeping the volume really low. The fifth thing we can do to intensify our sprint training is to intensify our strength training. So once general strength and absolute strength qualities have been developed, strength training should emphasize reactive strength abilities and faster eccentric loading. So you might go from slower, more controlled eccentrics to faster eccentrics. You might go from larger ranges of motion to smaller ranges of motion on certain exercises. If you were doing deep squats with a controlled descent down during the eccentric, you might progress to half squats, and then those half squats can progress to drop squats at the same depth where you're dropping very fast and trying to reverse the load as fast as possible from the bottom. And then you can further progress that to shallow drop squats where you're not reaching a very low depth, but you're reversing the load very fast, and movements in all direction are done as fast as you can. If you're using hex bar jumps, you might go from normal hex bar jumps to lighter hex bar jumps to hex bar hops, and then to a banded hex bar hop where the band is pulling you down faster than you could normally drop. These are all different ways that we can intensify our lifts in a way that's relevant to sprinting. Plyometrics can progress from longer ground contact times and slower jumps, such as a counter movement jump, to exercises with a shorter ground contact time or a shorter stretch shortening cycle action. So a counter movement jump might progress to a drop jump. Medium hurdle hops may progress to low hurdle hops so that the ground contact times become shorter. And pogo hops may progress to band assisted hops. So now we're getting off the ground quicker than we could normally by using variations in our training to emphasize intensification and moving faster, getting off the ground quicker, all that sort of thing. By incrementally shifting both our specific and non-specific work toward faster, more reactive variations, we can help ensure that all of our body systems are being given a stimulus which encourages us to run at faster sprinting speeds. Last but not least, if we want to run faster and intensify our sprint training, we need to have strategic program design. So if you're truly trying to run your fastest at practice, your program design and training schedule should prioritize fast sprinting. You may need to add in more rest days, adjust volumes, or adjust the frequency of your training to accomplish this. For some people, they might do better with a lower frequency, higher volume training setup, where they have more days in between their training sessions to rest and recover, and then they plan to sprint on certain days when they know that they're going to be most recovered and able to run really fast. For other people who can't quite handle higher volumes of sprint training, maybe they can benefit from a higher frequency program, but with very low volumes in each training session. So you might find that you do better with 4 days of sprinting per week, but each of those sprinting workouts is of a very low volume, so that way you can recover, sprint on back-to-back days, and then take, 1 or 2 days off before you come back for another 2-day microcycle of sprinting. But either way, whether you prefer to do higher volume sessions with 3 days in between or something like that, or you prefer to do a higher frequency approach with very low volumes of sprinting, you need to strategically plan your program around what is going to put you in the best state of readiness to perform at practice on the days where you're planning to sprint fast. You should not approach your sprint training, especially as you get close to competition, in the way where you're looking at it like, I need to fit every possible variation of sprinting and lifting and jumping and all these different workouts into my program to where you're now stressed out about whether or not you're doing enough. Your focus needs to shift more toward how can I emphasize the fastest sprinting possible on certain days, and how can I build my program around that? How can I set myself up to run the fastest on these specific days, and then on the other days the whole goal is basically to get ready for those most important workouts. We don't want to get caught up in being worried about whether or not we're doing enough, or are we getting everything in that we need to get in. The closer you are to competition, the more it needs to be focused on having high quality sprint training sessions, and so you need to program your whole training program strategically to allow for the fastest, highest quality sprint training sessions on the days where you go out to sprint. So like I said, as we approach the competitive season, we need to intensify our sprint training. This can come in the form of picking the right distances, picking the right rest periods, adding a level of competition into practice, emphasizing non-resisted sprints so that the average velocity we're sprinting at when we look at the total volume of sprinting in our program is higher than it was earlier in the year. We can intensify our strength training and plyometrics to make sure that we're sending consistent signals to the body with regards to how we want it to adapt, that we want it to get faster, we want to get quicker off the ground, handle eccentric loading at higher velocities. All of those things which are relevant to sprinting, we need to transition our strength training and our plyometric training in a way that is cohesive and beneficial to what we're trying to achieve and do on the track. And last but not least, like I said, we need to strategically program all of the training we're doing to be built around being as ready as possible to run fast on the days we plan to run fast, and then in between the goal is to recover as well as possible so we can come back for another fast sprinting day when we plan for it in our training program. And if we do this, if we appropriately progress our training and we do it at the right time with the right volumes and we intensify our training as we get closer to competition, we're going to have our best shot of running fast in competition at the right time, setting new personal bests, and having a good time when we go out to compete.